Number 1. Bully. I used to take the commuter train to go to school. I went to a private school and it was a bit far from my home. So I'd walk down to the train station every day and take it to school. I'd also take it home and then walk home. School was over around 3 p.m., and the school was right near the train station. I generally always enjoyed the ride home more than the morning ride. In the morning, the train was always packed with people. I figured the majority of them were going to work. But since I got out of school long before rush hour time, and the fact that there were not many other students on the train, it was largely empty for the ride home. I very often would have a whole car all to myself. On this day, I was riding the train home from school. I had gotten on the train and found the car empty. The train cars themselves had doors between them, which allowed passengers to move between the cars when the train was stationary. Although some passengers would go through the doors when the train was moving. I'd never done it before myself, because it just looked scary to walk between the cars. Well, this day, I was reading from my textbook when I heard one of the doors open. Looking up, I immediately wished that I hadn't. Standing there was a kid from my school who always bullied me. I had never seen him on the train before, so I wondered why he was there. I gulped, and I jerked my head down really quick, hoping that he would not have seen me. Unfortunately, he had. He walked up to me and stood in the aisle by my seat. I could feel him glaring at me. I kept praying that a conductor would come along. I didn't meet his glare, though. I just kept looking at my book. He then reached out with his hand under my book and hit my book. This caused the book to fly up and hit me in the face before falling down to the floor. Before I could say anything or grab my book, he grabbed me and put me in a headlock. I struggled, but he was way too strong for me. Roughly, he pulled me over to the door between the cars. My stomach went cold when I thought about what he might do. Opening the door, he put his foot in the way of the door to prevent it from closing. He then took me and tried to push me down between the cars. Yeah, he was stronger than me, and he easily pulled me across the car. However, scared for my life, I was able to muster up enough resistance in order to keep him from pushing me out there. I guess there was also the argument that maybe he wasn't really trying to hurt me, he was just trying to scare me. So maybe he wasn't using all of his strength. Regardless, I was terrified and just completely bawling. He was calling me names and laughing at me, all the while trying to push me into the space between the cars. He did finally succeed in pushing me into the space. Fortunately, you could stand on the ends of the car and not fall down between the cars. So I wasn't completely in danger yet. He punched me in the stomach a couple times, and then finally, a conductor came into the car from the other side. He yelled at the bully, ran over to him and pulled him off of me. He then pulled me out from in between the cars and I collapsed on the floor. Fortunately, the conductor was much bigger than the bully and was able to hold on to him. And this is the positive part of the story. The train stopped at the next stop. The conductors did not open the doors. They made an announcement that the train would be delayed because of an incident. What they had done was call the police, and they kept the bully from leaving the train until the police arrived. Seeing that bully handcuffed and escorted out of the train and into a police car was the most satisfying experience of my young life. Looking back, I can't say I know how much danger I was really in. I don't really know if I would have been able to even fall between the cars. But at the age I was then, it was really terrifying. Number 2. A game of chicken. My friend Josh and I were hanging out one day. I think we were about 13 years old at the time. I remember this happening in the late fall, because there were still a lot of leaves falling from the trees. We had hopped a fence and followed some train tracks that went through a local forest. We liked walking on the rails and pretending we were tightrope walkers. Yeah, I know that sounds pretty lame, but we enjoyed it. Even though we weren't supposed to play on the train tracks, we were absolutely safe. I mean, there is no way that we would not know exactly when a train was coming. It would be loud and we'd see it. The forested area was not so thick in trees that you couldn't see far down the tracks. We'd been hanging out, balancing and talking for a while. We then saw someone who was also walking on the tracks. He was a bit off in the distance, and walking towards us. I couldn't tell how old he was, but figured he was a teenager. Maybe a couple years older than both me and Josh were. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie. He had his hood up over his head, his hands in the front pocket of the hoodie, and he was looking down as he walked right in the middle of the train tracks. This really wasn't unusual. We'd seen other people walk by the tracks while we were out. It was probably just someone who wanted to be alone. Or maybe someone who had been out for a walk, and the train tracks were the best way to find your way. Anyhow, the guy was still a bit away from us. It was then that we heard it. There was a train coming, and we heard it coming from behind us. Josh and I looked back, and the train was at a very safe distance behind us. So the two of us jumped off the rail, and we walked a couple of yards away from the tracks. You know, so the sound wouldn't deafen us. We looked over at the guy walking towards us. He didn't get off the track. I recall feeling a bit uneasy. Josh thought it was just a guy that was going to play a game of chicken with the train. That was an activity that I always thought was dumb as hell. I yelled at the guy that a train was coming, which in a way seemed pointless. There was no way he didn't hear the train. But he didn't move. He just kept walking in the middle of the track, right in the direction of the train. As the train quickly passed us by, I tried running forward a bit. I was really scared that this guy wasn't moving. I screamed at him a couple times, but there was no way he could have heard me over the train. The rest happened so fast that my brain had trouble processing it. I kept expecting the guy to jump out of the way of the train at the last minute, like it was some sort of action movie. Instead, the train hit him straight on. He didn't even try to move. I immediately collapsed on the ground and threw up, and Josh did too. I won't describe what we saw. It was too awful. The train stopped, of course. The police and the fire department came in. We waited there in case they wanted to talk to us. Come to find out later, the guy was a student at our high school. He had left a suicide note to his parents and let a train hit him. Words will never describe how awful the experience was. I had nightmares about it for years afterwards. Often in those nightmares, I would feel the blood splashing over to me before I woke up screaming. Number 3. The Ride Home. This story is told from a woman's perspective. I work in the city and live out in the suburbs. To avoid traffic, I take the commuter train to and from work. It's economical, saves time, and is generally a pretty stress-free way of traveling. I say generally because I once had a really awful experience riding home from work. To set the scene a little, this happened in the winter. So the sun was already down when I got off work at 5 p.m. In addition, it was snowing. I made it to the train station, and it was really crowded. I had to push my way onto the train and tried to find a good seat. The cars were pretty filled up already. I ended up sitting in the only open spot in the entire car. It was a bench seat, and I was sitting beside a pretty big guy. When you ride trains, you get used to having to sit next to people. But even so, You can sometimes sit next to somebody who makes you really uncomfortable. And that happened in this case. The guy I was sitting next to was a pretty big guy, and he made me uneasy right away. Even though the trains were crowded, the bench seats were big enough to allow space between the two passengers sitting on them. He kept trying to press up against me. I kept my earbuds in order to keep him from trying to talk to me, but he was obviously not keeping to his side of the seat. As much as I tried to just ignore him, he made the whole ride very uncomfortable for me. Several times, I really wanted to get up and just walk away. But the train was really crowded. There were passengers standing in the aisle, and there wasn't any room to move. Plus, I did consider that he might not have been trying to do anything, and maybe he didn't notice it. The stop before mine was over, and I realized I'd have to get up then, in order to make it out at my stop. I got up, and tried to force myself through the crowd of people. I made my way out to the doors. The train stopped and I got off. With a bit of a shock, I saw that the man had also gotten off, out the doors from the next car down. There were a lot of people getting off at that stop, but I noticed him looking directly at me, and he kept looking. He lit up a cigarette and just stood by the train station, watching me as I walked away. Most of the other passengers got into their cars and drove off. I was walking home, though. I kept looking back over my shoulder. For the longest time he just stood there, smoking his cigarette and watching me. When the crowd dispersed, however, he crushed out his cigarette and began walking in my direction, and he was walking fast. I sped up, now really worried. I checked back over my shoulder and was scared to see that he was now running after me. I had no idea what he intended, but I knew it couldn't be good. Well, the next part is pretty blurry. He must have caught up with me and tackled me, because I recall getting hit and falling to the sidewalk. I hit my head on the sidewalk hard and completely blacked out. I woke up in the hospital with a concussion and quite a few lacerations. The guy had a knife on him, and he had cut my shirt up pretty bad. He had run off, though, when a couple of senior citizens were out taking a walk and saw him. They called an ambulance for me. The police never found this guy. We had no idea what he intended, but I guess I could have guessed. But since he was not caught, I was scared to death for the longest time. Whenever I went to work, whenever I walked down the street, whenever I was on a train, I was terrified of the littlest things. It took a long time for me to recover from that. But since he was not caught, I was scared to death for the longest time. Whenever I went to work, whenever I walked down the street, whenever I was on a train, I was terrified of the littlest things. It took a long time for me to recover from that. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the subscribe button below, or the button that will appear at the end of this closing. Feel free to leave me some comments to let me know what you thought of this video, and share it with someone you think might enjoy it. Feel free to follow Ichigo and myself on Facebook and Twitter. If you have a story that you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address provided in the description. I hope you're all having a nice holiday season. It's very cold here today, so I'm going to go have a cup of tea and try to keep warm. I hope that you'll remember to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.